What happens when someone confesses a 40-year lie on live television and Dr. Phil says stop and shuts down the cameras? I need everyone to stop. Stop the cameras. Stop recording. Right now. Dr. Phil's voice cut through the studio like a knife. The guest sitting across from him was trembling, tears streaming down their face, having just uttered 7 words that changed everything. I've been lying for 40 years. What happened in the next few minutes would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. The studio went completely silent. No one moved. The audience, usually so animated, sat frozen in their seats. Production assistants looked at each other in confusion. Dr. Phil never stops recording. In 25 years of broadcasting, through thousands of confessions, confrontations, and breakthroughs, he had never once stopped the cameras mid-show. But this was different. 72-year-old Margaret sat in the guest chair, her hands shaking as she held a worn envelope that she'd carried with her for 4 decades. She had come to the show with her daughter Linda, who believed they were there to discuss family communication issues. Linda had no idea what was actually coming. But Dr. Phil knew. He had seen the pre-interview. He knew what was in that envelope. And he knew this wasn't going to be just another show. The episode had started normally enough. Margaret and Linda walked out to applause, settling into the iconic chairs across from Dr. Phil. The audience smiled, expecting a typical family therapy session, maybe some hurt feelings about missed birthdays or unspoken resentments. So Margaret, you reached out to the show because you said there's something you need to tell your daughter. Dr. Phil began gently. Something you've been carrying for a very long time. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Her fingers traced the edges of the envelope in her lap. Linda reached over and touched her mother's hand. Mom, whatever it is, we can work through it. That's why we're here. Margaret looked at her daughter with eyes that held decades of pain. Linda, I need to tell you something. And it's going to change everything you know about our family. Dr. Phil leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from clinical curiosity to deep concern. He could see this wasn't rehearsed emotion. This was real, raw, and about to explode. Take your time, Margaret, he said quietly. When you're ready. Margaret took a shaky breath. Linda, you always wondered why you never met your father. Why I never talked about him. Why there were no pictures. Linda nodded slowly, tension building in her shoulders. You said he left before I was born. That he wanted nothing to do with us. I lied. Margaret's voice broke on the word. I lied about everything. The audience leaned forward collectively. Dr. Phil's expression remained neutral, but his eyes never left Margaret's face. Your father didn't leave. He never even knew you existed. Linda's face went pale. What do you mean he didn't know? Margaret clutched the envelope tighter. I was young, scared, pregnant, and my parents, your grandparents, they said if I told him, they would disown me. They said he wasn't good enough for our family. They said I had to choose, him or them. And you chose them. Linda whispered, beginning to understand. I chose them. And I've spent 40 years living with that choice. 40 years watching you grow up without a father. 40 years of you asking about him, and me lying straight to your face. Dr. Phil paused mid-sentence. The studio went completely silent. Margaret, Dr. Phil said carefully, is he still alive? Margaret nodded, tears flowing freely now. He's alive. And he never stopped looking for me. That's when she opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, some with stamps that were decades old. These are from him? Linda asked, her voice barely audible. These are from him. He wrote to my parents' address for years, begging to know if I was okay. Begging to know if the baby, if you, were okay. My parents intercepted every letter and never told me. Linda took one of the letters, her hands shaking as she unfolded the brittle paper. Her eyes scanned the words written 40 years ago by a man she'd never met. A man who was her father. Dear Sarah. It began. Sarah was Margaret's maiden name. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I have to try. If there's a baby, our baby, please let me know. Please let me be a father. I don't care what your parents think. I love you. I love our child. Please subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The letter was dated 3 months after Linda was born. There were more letters from when Linda turned 1, turned 5, started school. Each one begging for contact, begging for a chance. How did you get these? Linda asked, her voice thick with emotion. Last year, when your grandmother died, I found them in a box in her attic. Every single letter he ever sent. She kept them all, but she never gave them to me. Never told me he was trying to reach us. Dr. Phil stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the stage. He looked out at the audience, then back at Margaret and Linda. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that everyone in the studio felt. Margaret, why are you telling Linda this now? After 40 years? Margaret looked directly at her daughter. Because 3 weeks ago, I found him. He's alive. He's 74 years old. He never married. He never had other children. And when I called him, do you know what the first thing he said was? Linda was crying openly now, mascara streaming down her face. He said, "Is my daughter okay? Please tell me my daughter is okay." The audience gasped. Several people were crying. Dr. Phil's jaw tightened, a sign anyone who watches the show regularly knows means he's fighting to maintain his professional composure. Linda, Margaret continued, he wants to meet you. He's wanted to meet you for 40 years. And I'm here today because I need to tell you the truth before you meet him. I need you to know that none of this was his fault. It was mine. I'm the one who kept him from you. Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. He turned to the audience and said, "We're going to take a break. And during that break, I need to speak with Margaret and Linda privately." The audience murmured, "This never happens. The show doesn't stop." But Dr. Phil had made the call. "Everyone stay in your seats," he told the audience. "But give us a moment." He gestured for Margaret and Linda to follow him behind the set. The cameras stopped rolling. For the first time in the show's history, what happened next wouldn't be broadcast. But what happened in that back room is something that the crew who witnessed it will never forget. According to the producers who were present, Dr. Phil sat down with both women and said something that wasn't in any script, wasn't part of any planned segment. "Margaret, you carried this for 40 years. You can't carry it for one more second. Linda, you're about to meet your father. But before you do, you need to decide something. Are you going to meet him carrying your mother's guilt, or are you going to meet him free?" Linda looked at her mother, then at Dr. Phil. "What do you mean?" "Your mother made a choice 40 years ago that she regrets. She let other people's fears control her life. But you don't have to make that same choice. You can choose forgiveness. You can choose to move forward. Or you can choose to let this destroy your relationship with your mother and poison your relationship with your father before it even starts." But what happened next is something no one in the room, or watching at home, saw coming. Linda stood up, walked over to her mother, and wrapped her arms around her. Margaret collapsed into her daughter's embrace, sobbing. "I forgive you, Mom," Linda whispered. "I forgive you." They stood there for several minutes, mother and daughter, holding each other while 40 years of lies and pain melted away. When they returned to the stage, the audience could see immediately that something had changed. The tension was gone. In its place was something that looked like peace. Dr. Phil addressed the audience directly. "What you're about to see didn't happen on camera. We stopped recording because some moments are too sacred to be broadcast. But Margaret and Linda have agreed to share what comes next with you." He turned to Linda. "Are you ready to meet your father?" Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face, but this time they were different tears. These weren't tears of pain or betrayal. These were tears of anticipation. Dr. Phil picked up his phone and made a call. "Bring him in." The studio doors opened. An elderly man walked in slowly, leaning slightly on a cane. He had white hair, kind eyes, and when he saw Linda, he stopped in his tracks. "Linda?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Dad?" she responded. He crossed the stage faster than anyone thought a 74-year-old man with a cane could move. Linda stood up, and they met in the middle of the stage, holding each other for the first time. The audience wasn't just crying, they were sobbing. Grown men in the back row had tears streaming down their faces. Production assistants behind the cameras were wiping their eyes. Margaret watched from her chair, witnessing the reunion she had prevented for 4 decades. Dr. Phil stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You gave her a gift today," he said quietly. "The gift of truth. And that's the only foundation any relationship can be built on." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Dr. Phil arranged for the family to meet with a therapist who specializes in reunification and family trauma. He provided resources for Linda and her father to build their relationships slowly and healthily. He also connected Margaret with a counselor who could help her process the guilt she'd carried for so long. 6 months later, Margaret sent Dr. Phil a letter. In it, she included a photo of Linda's wedding, the first wedding in the family where Linda's father walked her down the aisle. Margaret and Linda's father weren't together romantically, but they had become friends, united by their love for their daughter. "You told me on your show that the truth would set me free," Margaret wrote. "I didn't believe you then. I thought the truth would destroy my family. But you were right. The truth didn't destroy us. The lies were what was destroying us. The truth saved us." The legacy of that day extends far beyond one family. Dr. Phil later said in an interview that stopping the recording was one of the hardest decisions he'd made in his career. "As a psychologist, I knew that moment needed to be protected. As a TV host, I knew it would make incredible television. I had to choose which one mattered more. And in that moment, the human being in front of me mattered more than the show." The episode, when it finally aired months later with the family's permission, became one of the most watched in the show's history. But more importantly, it sparked thousands of people to reach out to family members they'd been estranged from, to tell truths they'd been hiding, to seek forgiveness they thought was impossible. The envelope that Margaret brought that day, the one filled with 40 years of unopened letters, now sits in a frame in Linda's home. It's a reminder that truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most comfortable lie. And it's a testament to what happens when someone like Dr. Phil recognizes that some moments are bigger than television. They're about human dignity, healing, and the courage it takes to finally tell the truth. The lesson from that day remains clear. Lies, no matter how well-intentioned, eventually destroy what they were meant to protect. But truth, no matter how painful, has the power to heal, restore, and rebuild what was lost. Margaret's 40 years of lying had robbed Linda of a father, and robbed her father of a daughter. But one moment of truth gave them all back to each other. And that's the power of honesty. It may hurt in the moment, but it heals for a lifetime. 3 years later, the ripple effects of that confession continued to spread. Linda and her father, whose name was Robert, had built a relationship that neither thought possible. They had Sunday dinners together, went fishing, and Robert finally got to hear all the stories about Linda's childhood that he missed. Margaret attended therapy regularly, and had learned to forgive herself. "I can't change the past," she told the follow-up Dr. Phil segment via video call. "But I can make sure the rest of our lives aren't defined by my mistakes." The show received over 50,000 letters from viewers who said that watching Margaret's confession gave them the courage to tell their own truths. One woman reconnected with a son she'd given up for adoption 30 years earlier. A man finally told his family about a sibling they never knew existed. A daughter admitted to her parents that she'd been hiding an addiction for a decade. Dr. Phil's decision to stop the cameras that day had set a new standard for how television can serve humanity rather than just entertainment. In interviews, he reflected on that moment. "People asked me why I stopped recording. The answer is simple. I'm a psychologist first and a TV host second. That woman needed a therapist in that moment, not a producer. Her daughter needed a safe space to process, not a camera in her face. Some things are bigger than ratings." The envelope of letters became a symbol of hope for thousands of families. It proved that even when someone gives up on you, even when years pass, love doesn't expire. Robert had written those letters not knowing if they'd ever be read, but he wrote them anyway because love compelled him to keep trying. And that's the real lesson from Margaret's 40 years of lies. Truth might be painful, but it's the only foundation strong enough to build a real relationship on. Robert kept every single letter Linda ever sent him after their reunion. He carried them in his wallet, just like he'd carried the hope of meeting her for 40 years. "I waited my whole life to be called Dad," he told Dr. Phil in a follow-up interview. "And it was worth every second of waiting." The story reminds us that some wounds can heal, some relationships can be restored, and some truths, no matter how long they've been buried, can finally set us free.